Hello again. This lecture will complete our overview of the sacred texts of Judaism. The process by which Jews became the people of the book began after the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and then it reached its culmination a few centuries after the Romans leveled the second temple in 70 of the Common Era. In the absence of kings, prophets, and priests, a new group arose to help Jews scattered all over the world fashion a new identity and preserve their traditions. These were the rabbis, or teachers of Torah. The word rabbi means my master. Unlike priests or kings, being a rabbi was not a hereditary position. It came through individual effort and study. And although there are no rabbis mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, the profession had its roots in the Second Temple era with the Pharisees. The historian Josephus described three philosophical groups or parties among the Jews in the 2nd to the 1st centuries BCE. The first group were the Essenes. These Jews rejected the authority of the temple priesthood and they withdrew from society to live lives of purity and asceticism. Remember, these were probably the group that were responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. The second group in the 1st century BCE were the Sadducees. And these were wealthy, aristocratic, priestly authorities who were associated with the temple. And third were the Pharisees, who were devoted to the study and application of the Mosaic Law. Although the Pharisees kept their jobs and their families, they nevertheless tried to maintain a level of ritual purity in their homes that would have been appropriate to the temple. Josephus tells us that the Pharisees were respected and better liked than the Sadducees, whom the common people saw as collaborators with the Romans. The Pharisees and Sadducees did not get along very well, and one of the main points of contention between them was the Torah. The Pharisees claimed that when God had given Moses the 5 books at Mount Sinai, he had also revealed to Moses an oral Torah of explanations and interpretations, and this oral Torah was passed down by word of mouth to later generations all the way to the Pharisees. This was, they claimed, the origin of their distinctive beliefs and interpretations, such as how a monetary fine could be substituted for actual mutilation when Leviticus spoke of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, or their belief in the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the dead. Those were two doctrines that had been rejected by the Sadducees because they weren't taught clearly in the written Torah. Sometimes English speakers today use the word Pharisee to criticize someone as a self-righteous rule keeper, but that betrays a Christian bias. Jesus was often critical of the Pharisees in the New Testament. There are stories of confrontations between Jesus and the Pharisees. Our first-hand knowledge of the Pharisees, however, is rather limited. There's only one author from the Second Temple period who explicitly states, "I was a Pharisee." And that one author was Paul, the apostle, who's hardly an unbiased witness. Nevertheless, from what we can piece together of their beliefs from later sources, the Pharisees were sometimes strict, but they could also be humanely lenient. For instance, the Mosaic Law forbids carrying certain objects outside of one's home on the Sabbath, which would have made it impossible for someone to take a meal to share with friends, or to use a cane, or even to carry a baby outdoors. The Pharisees, however, were not just strictly, rules for the sake of rules. They made a decision that if houses were surrounded by a common fence, they could be counted as a single domicile. So within that area, people could carry a cane or do some of these other things. This rabbinical ruling is why there's a thin wire called an eruv that encircles many neighborhoods in cities with large Jewish populations. It's usually strung up by telephone wires. With that enclosure, it allows all of the Jews who live in houses in that area to regard themselves as living in one greater domicile, and it provides a ritual enclosure that allows for mobility on the Sabbath. After the Great Revolt of 66 to 70 in the Common Era, when the Essenes were wiped out, This is when the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden away and the temple was destroyed. And remember, the temple is the power base of the Sadducees. The Pharisees, led by rabbis, became dominant. Their emphasis on studying Torah even became more pronounced after the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 136 CE. Some Jews had seen Simon Bar Kokhba as a Messiah who would restore Jewish political independence, but the rebellion was brutally suppressed by the Romans, and the dispersal of Jews from the Holy Land accelerated, and the rabbis began to regard apocalypticism and political aspirations as dead ends. Right? They'd gone that way, looking for a political Messiah. It ended in disaster. And Judaism then became more of a text-centered religion, with a focus on adherence to the moral and ritual requirements of the law. Modern Judaism is rabbinical Judaism. By contrast, Christianity, which also had its origins as a Jewish offshoot in the aftermath of the Great Revolt, continued its apocalyptic expectations of the end of the world. You may remember that the book of Revelation is what concludes the New Testament and looks forward to that final destruction. Jews eagerly sought for power, spiritual and otherwise. It's important to observe that modern Judaism and Christianity do not have a mother-daughter relationship. They're sister religions that took place at about the same time. The Jewish rabbis looked to the Torah, both written and oral, as the key to the survival of the religion. But there were concerns about the accuracy and transmission of the oral Torah. So about 200 CE, Rabbi Judah Hanazi, means Judah the patriarch, wrote down the first part of the oral Torah, the Mishnah. I guess it sort of makes a contradiction, right? That you have now a written form of the oral Torah. The Mishnah means repetition or oral instruction. It's not exactly a law code. It's more like a collection of legal judgments, some of which are attributed to specific rabbis. In the Mishnah, there are 128 named rabbis, and frequently more than one opinion is recorded. The Mishnah is a fairly lengthy book. It's organized into 6 parts or orders. The first part is called Seeds, and it has regulations and rules about agriculture and prayers. The second part is appointed seasons, Sabbath, the festivals, fast days. The third is women, and that has regulations concerning marriage and divorce and vows. The fourth is called damages, and that includes business relations, law courts, and punishments. The fifth is holy things, so there are dietary laws and then rules about the temple and sacrifices. Remember, this is being written down about 100 years after the destruction of the temple. So they're trying to retain these traditions that really don't have much practical application anymore. And the sixth and final part of the Mishnah is called purities, and it deals with, as you might imagine, rules about ritual purity and purification. Each of these 6 orders has between 7 and 12 subsections called tractates, for a total of 63. The judgments within the Mishnah are terse and orderly, as if the texts were designed for memorization or teaching. And in this way, it's similar perhaps to Hindu sutras like the Yoga Sutra. We can see how the Mishnah operates by reading the first paragraph, which concerns rules for reciting daily evening prayers, the Shema. And remember, this is the prayer that begins, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So the Mishnah starts out by asking a question, from what time may people recite the evening Shema? The answer, from the hour that the priests come in to eat of their heave offering until the end of the first watch. These are Rabbi Eliezer's words. But the sages say until midnight. Rabbi Gamaliel says until the first light of dawn. There was a case when his sons came back from a feast, and they said to him, "We've not recited Shema." And he said to them, "If the first light of dawn has not appeared, you are obliged to recite." Okay, there's the end of my quotation. And not only in this case, no, I'm continuing the quotation. And not only in this case, but in every case where the sages have said until midnight, the commandment applies until the first light of dawn. The burning of fat parts and prescribed limbs on the altar. These are the old temple sacrifices. The commandment to do so applies until the first light of dawn. all sacrifices which are to be eaten for only one day. The commandment to do so applies until the first light of dawn. If so, why did the sages say until midnight? In order to keep a man away from transgression. Okay, that was a long quotation, but you can see that sort of the way that this thought unfolds is if it says midnight, why is it really allowed to go until dawn? And the idea there seems to be that gap will allow people some buffer time. It's natural for human beings to forget. If you don't say the evening prayers or do things that you need to do in the evening by midnight, you still have until dawn to get those important tasks accomplished. The passage then goes on to other aspects of evening and morning prayers, including an argument between the followers of Shammai and those of Hillel as to whether you had to actually lie down to say the evening prayer. As Shammai and Hillel were two of the great rabbis, and their disputations were legendary, with Shammai generally taking the stricter side. He answered, so in this argument, he answered, yes, Deuteronomy says, it literally says, in quotes, when you lie down and when you rise up. So you have to lie down. That's what Shammai says. Very strict interpretation. Hillel said, no, it's not required. It's just customary. And then a later rabbi tells a story, this is still in the Mishnah, of how once when traveling, he laid down to pray as Shammai demanded and nearly lost his life to rabbis. That's wrong. Nearly lost his life to robbers. And other rabbis respond, well, that's what you get when you go against the opinions of Hillel. So there's these disputations that go back and forth. Both sides are argued about. Rabbis line up on one side or the other. But then again, another part of the Mishnah says, any dispute which is for the sake of heaven will in the end yield results. And what's a dispute for the sake of heaven? This is the sort of dispute between Hillel and Shammai. Somehow, it's important that we get both of these perspectives, that the arguments go back and forth on, and that sort of critical thinking and of argumentation is something that's pleasing to God. It keeps the tradition going, and it's put within the Mishnah. So this is a very unusual sort of law code. Multiple opinions are offered, often with no single one being pronounced right, and it's not comprehensive. There's nothing in the Mishnah about mezuzahs or about the handling of Torah scrolls, for instance. Rabbis, when they're arguing with each other, quote scripture. They cite precedents from now defunct temple practices. They say, yes, but from this perspective, things could be different, and they tell stories. Rather than just providing a correct answer, the Mishnah is a tool for teaching students how to think through difficult issues, how to come up with reasonable opinions themselves, and how to defend those opinions. I want to draw your attention to one of the most famous of the Mishnah's subsections. The tractate Avot, which means fathers, is unusual in that it doesn't have any legal rulings. Instead, it consists entirely of ethical maxims of 60 rabbis who lived between 200 BCE and 200 CE. It's one of the most beloved and quoted parts of the Mishnah. Well worth your time for a quick look. You may have already heard the saying it attributes to Rabbi Hillel, who says in the Avot tractate, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?" I also particularly like these two quotations. "Do not say, when I have time I shall study, for you may never have time." And then a second favorite of mine, "It's not your job to finish the work, but you're not free to walk away from it." Of course, the conversations between rabbis continued, with rabbis and their students debating the meaning of the Mishnah, particularly in the academies in Palestine and Babylonia. Out of these debates about the Mishnah comes the Talmud, also considered part of the Oral Torah, which goes even further with learned disputations, detailed legal analysis, folk tales, stories of famous teachers, aphorisms, scriptural interpretations, and so much more. The oral traditions in Palestine were edited and written down about 400 in the Common Era, in what is commonly referred to as the Jerusalem Talmud. The word Talmud means teaching or learning. The discussions in Babylonia were similarly put into writing about 100 years later. The Babylonian Talmud, about 3 times longer than the Jerusalem version, has long been considered more eloquent, more subtle, and more complete. It's second only to the Tanakh in the library of sacred texts of Judaism. The Talmud, and by that term we usually mean the Babylonian Talmud, sometimes known as the Bavli, is a massive work consisting of some 2.5 million words. So it's 4 times the length of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and about 1/3 longer than the Mahabharata, that Indian epic. The Talmud reproduces the Mishnah, so it's there in Hebrew, and then it adds a commentary in Aramaic called the Gemara. And this commentary is an edited transcript of the debates of the rabbis and their students as they investigated, explained, and elaborated on the Mishnah and the principles they deduced from its rulings. Since early modern times, the Talmud has been printed with multiple commentaries surrounding the Mishnah and Gemara on each page, starting with the commentary of Rashi, the 11th century French scholar who also wrote one of the most popular commentaries on the Torah. So when you open up the Torah in Hebrew, you'll see that the Hebrew part and then an Aramaic part, it's same Hebrew letters, and then around it, surrounding it, are various commentaries in little boxes on the sides. It's a very complicated text to look at. It's a complicated text to read through. In modern English translations, the Neusner Talmud is 22 volumes, and the Sonsino Talmud, which includes the Hebrew and Aramaic text on facing pages, comes in at about 30 oversized volumes. It's huge. Fortunately, there are a number of edited selections from the Talmud that can give you some sense of things. Here's one story out of thousands, and I like this story in part because in it, a rabbi's wife sets him straight. The story says, there were some lawless men living in the neighborhood of Rabbi Meir, and they used to vex him sorely. Once, Rabbi Meir prayed for their death. His wife, Beruria, thereupon exclaimed, "What do you take as the sanction for your prayer? Is it because it's written, 'Let sinners cease out of the earth'?" It's a quotation from Psalms. But, she continues, still all quoting from the Talmud, but she continues, the verse may also be rendered to mean, "Let sin cease out of the earth." Consider, moreover, the conclusion of the verse, "And let the wicked be no more." When sin cease, the wicked shall be no more. This is the wife still talking. Rather should you pray that they will repent and be no more wicked. Rabbi Meir offered prayer on their behalf, and they repented. There are lots of great stories in the Talmud, but what you'll usually see on display is detailed legal reasoning, often backed up by quotations from the Tanakh. Rabbi Louis Jacobs, the 20th century founder of conservative Judaism in Britain, wrote a book called The Talmudic Argument, in which he describes the Talmud as follows. Theories are advanced and then contradicted. They are examined from many points of view and qualified where necessary. One argument leads to another when logic demands it. The claims of conflicting theories are investigated with great thoroughness and much subtlety. Fine distinctions abound between apparently similar concepts. The chapter titles in Rabbi Jacobs' book may be enough to capture the imagination of the legally inclined. So the titles of these chapters include things like unconscious abandonment of property, or conveyance of a thing not yet in existence, or indiscernible damage to property, and admission of part of a testimony even though another part of the same testimony is rejected. There are some impressive mental gymnastics going on here, but it's all within a sacred text. So in long, complicated arguments with frequent digressions and stories, the rabbis work their way through all aspects of Jewish life and lore with an astonishing level of psychological and philosophical nuance. Different scriptural interpretations and legal rulings from several generations are set side by side and given equal weight. When there was a practical need, one could be chosen as more authoritative, right? When you actually have to do something to decide what you're going to do. And usually they take consensus as being the more authoritative position. But dissenting opinions were nevertheless preserved within the Talmud for possible reevaluation and for use in future debates. The Talmud is a marvel in world literature, and it's impossible to overstate its importance in Judaism. Students can spend their entire lives exploring its contents, and indeed, Orthodox Jews probably spend more time with the Talmud than with the Tanakh. It's said that the Talmud contained so many verses from the Hebrew Bible that the commandment to study Scripture could be accomplished by studying the Talmud. But the Talmud is not just another commentary. There are plenty of those in Judaism. It's Torah. It's the oral counterpart to the written Torah that was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Many Jews believe that even today, Talmud study should be done aloud with a partner, taking turns in reading and then discussing its meaning line by line, page by page, as they work through it together. Although the rabbis were not prophets, the oral Torah provided access to continuing revelation. The will of God in new eras and new situations could be ascertained through the discussions of the rabbis in the Talmud. And this indeed was God's preferred mode of communication. One of the most famous stories in the Talmud tells of a heated debate about whether a certain kind of oven could be pronounced unclean if it were taken apart and then put back together again. Rabbi Eliezer said no, everybody else said yes. When Rabbi Eliezer failed to persuade his colleagues with arguments, he said, "If I'm right, let this tree be uprooted and thrown 100 feet. And then he said, if I'm right, let this stream flow backwards." Both of those things happened, but the other rabbis wouldn't budge. They still weren't persuaded. And Rabbi Eliezer said, "Let the walls of the school prove it." And the walls leaned in dangerously. And finally he said, "If I'm right, let heaven prove it." And a voice came from heaven saying, basically, Rabbi Eliezer is always right. But then Rabbi Joshua rejected the heavenly voice, citing a verse from Deuteronomy that says, it's not in heaven. The other rabbis agreed, stating, the Torah has already been given from Mount Sinai, so we do not pay attention to echoes. The rule from Exodus is follow the majority. Okay, how did God, the voice from heaven, react to this defiance? I mean, the other rabbis aren't going to be persuaded that Rabbi Eliezer is right, even when a voice comes from heaven. And according to the Talmud, God laughed and said, "My children have overcome me. My children have overcome me." In other words, once God has set up the system of the two Torahs, the written and the oral Torah, and then set up the proper procedures for their interpretation, even he can't intervene. And he was delighted when the rabbis pointed this out to him. It's a tale that might remind us of Abraham challenging God's decision to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, negotiating until God agrees to spare the cities if he can find just 10 righteous people in them. You remember he doesn't, and then he destroys it. But it's that sort of debate. It's people sort of giving God their best understanding and using their best evidence, and the God of Israel respects human intelligence and agency. The idea of a sacred oral text might remind us of the Hindu Vedas, but there are important differences. The Vedas, as you recall, were used primarily in rituals, where they were valued more for their sacred sounds than for their meanings, at least with regard to the Samhitas, the hymns that were used in those sacrifices. And the Vedas always remained the prized possession of priests. The Talmud, by contrast, didn't have a role in public worship services. Its meaning was endlessly investigated and debated, and Jews from all walks of life were encouraged to study it. The Mishnah recommended combining Torah study with a profession. And in modern times, women too have been encouraged to take part in Talmud study. Today, most forms of Judaism have female rabbis. Tens of thousands of Jews all over the world participate in the Daf Yomi program. It means page of the day, which was started in Poland in the 1920s. The idea is that you can read through the entire Talmud in 7.5 years if you read just one page a day. It's one page, 2 sides every day. The specified page for the day is the same for everyone, and you can download that page in Hebrew or in translation to your phone. And there are celebrations at the end of each cycle of 7.5 years. And why not? The Talmud says that God himself studies Torah 3 hours a day. The sacred texts of Judaism, in order of authority and holiness, are the Torah, first, the Pentateuch, and then the Tanakh, including the prophets and the writings, and then the Talmud, which includes the Mishnah. But the library of Judaism goes much, much further. There's an extensive supplement to the Mishnah called the Tosefta that predates the Talmud, and it is similarly discussions by rabbis about the meaning of the Mishnah. There are rather free commentaries on the Tanakh called Midrash that were written by rabbinic sages before the year 1000. And in those commentaries, they explain the text, they sometimes elaborate or enlarge the text, but most especially, they make applications of the text to contemporary issues and questions. In the medieval period, there were voluminous commentaries to the Hebrew Bible, as well as works of Jewish philosophy and attempts to codify the rulings of the Talmud. So Maimonides wrote major books in both of those latter categories. But in the midst of all this learning and studying, there were also Jews who were looking for more direct ways to connect with God through mystical practices. Jewish mysticism, or Kabbalah, is a large, fascinating topic, and I won't do much with it here. There are a number of introductions that you can consult, including a great courses lecture series that compares the mystical traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But I want to mention briefly just one text that many Jews have considered sacred, the Zohar. The title means the Book of Splendor. Indeed, from about 1500 to 1800, this masterpiece of Kabbalah was regarded by some as a source of doctrine and revelation almost equal in authority to the Torah and the Talmud. The Zohar first appeared in 13th century Spain, published by Rabbi Moses de Leon, who claimed that he had found an ancient Aramaic text dating back to the 2nd century, a text that was written by the Palestinian master Simeon ben Yochai and his disciples. The Zohar is composed of several separate treatises, including a spiritual commentary on the weekly synagogue readings from the 5 books of Moses, a story of an encounter with a great mystic who is disguised as a donkey driver, a narrative of a visionary journey to the Garden of Eden, and a report of a gathering of Simeon ben Yochai and his companions as they speak about the esoteric hidden meanings of the Torah, particularly with regard to the 10 emanations of God. Modern scholars have determined that the entire Zohar was probably written by Moses de Leon himself, but that hasn't dampened the enthusiasm of many for this remarkable text. So when Jews today use the term Torah, they sometimes have in mind the 5 books of Moses, which they regard as first among equals, the most authoritative part of the Tanakh. But just as often, the Torah refers to both the written and oral traditions that were thought to have been received by Moses, the written traditions in the Tanakh and the oral traditions, particularly as they were embodied in the discussions in the Talmud. There are several forms of Judaism in the world today: Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, and Reconstructionism, which differ in their degree of observance of traditional rules and in their engagement with the modern world. But they all come out of rabbinical Judaism and its concern for the oral law. By contrast, the Karaites, who were a major Jewish group in the latter half of the first millennium and who rejected the teachings of the rabbis and the whole notion of oral Torah, much like the earlier Sadducees, the Karaites have nearly died out. There are only a few thousand of them left. The centrality of the Talmud to Judaism is such that it was often banned or even burned by Jewish authorities in the medieval period in various times of anti-Semitic activities. Yet the Talmud was also one of the first Jewish books after the Bible to be published with the new technology of the printing press, with a complete edition coming out in 1520, so only within about 70 years of the publication of the Gutenberg Bible. It's interesting to imagine how different Judaism would be today if it had not closed its canon with the Tanakh, and instead continued to produce new scriptures of equal or greater authority, much as was done in Hinduism or Buddhism. Certainly, the tradition of detailed textual analysis, rigorous interpretation, and voluminous commentary, especially as practiced in the Mishnah and the Talmud, was decisive in creating a community of close readers and tireless debaters who expressed their devotion to God through study. One last famous story. In the 1st century before the Common Era, a non-Jew approached the great Rabbi Hillel and challenged him, saying, "I will convert if you teach me the whole Torah while I stand on 1 foot," right? So he's looking for just like, give me the essence of that massive Talmudic argumentation and discourse, but I just want a little bit because you can't stand on your foot for very long. Hillel replied, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor." That is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Now go and study. Okay, we often use that tale and we focus on the golden rule part of the story, which can be found in most major religions. But it's the go and study that makes this version particularly Jewish. And it's an appropriate reminder of the way that Jews are and have been the people of the book.